it. I want to remind you guys, we've got the Christmas candlelighting service coming up on Tuesday. And then, of course, the following Tuesday evening, we'll be doing the burning bowl service. These are great services to invite someone to. In fact, it's amazing over the years how many people discover unity because somebody invited them to the Christmas Eve candlelighting service. Also looking for a few people to be willing to, I know when we start, we have a few people who will light candles and then work the aisles as far as getting everybody's candle lit at the end of the service. If you would be willing to help in that capacity, I've got a sign-up sheet out in the foyer, and we can kind of go over things before the service. Good morning. Many of you have heard the traditional Christian story of footprints in the sand. You know, a man has a dream that he's walking along a beautiful beach with God, and with each step he sees another chapter in his life. And then soon they turn and look back, and he sees footprints in the sand. But he notices that at his most challenging moments, there's only one set of footprints rather than two sets. And he's like, you know, God, those are the times I needed you most. And God says to him, well, those are the times I was carrying you. You know, it's a beautiful sentiment, but I want to, at the end, revisit the poem with someone who came up with a different version of it, which I think you'll appreciate. But as we know, today is considered the awakening of joy in anticipation of awakening once again the Christ light within us. So how often do you experience joy? Is it a far-off memory? Do you experience it daily, hourly, moment by moment? I got to level with you. December hasn't always been a joyous month in my life. And I know this is true for a lot of you, but all four of my grandparents passed away in December. In fact, the grandfather on my mother's side actually died on Christmas Day. So it's always been an interesting month in our family, that sense of, wow, we can tick off the anniversary dates of the passing of our grandparents. But also, back in 2011, Carla was really kind of concerned with me because I was depressed. And, being, of course, a unity minister, you're thinking, I should be able to pray my way out of this. I am very grateful that Consumer Reports at the time put out a special white paper on depression, and it had a test in there. And you take the test, and basically I came out as clinically depressed. And it also went over all of the various drugs that are in there that are available and which ones are most effective and that sort of thing. And so, I read this thing over, and I was going to this wonderful, I found the perfect counselor. He was a retired minister, who was also a licensed mental health counselor. So, he was very good to talk with. And, I was telling him, well, Carla's thinking, I took some St. John's wort, which is supposed to be, the herbal remedy, but that didn't work. And so I did finally go on Zoloft, and within 2 weeks, it was kind of like, wow, what a difference. It struck me how I had, of course, this had been a long, gradual process to that point where I just wasn't feeling joy anymore. And then then as I'm talking to family members, I found a number of my family members had encountered the same thing and went on antidepressants, but never shared it with the rest of the family. There seems to be this embarrassment when we're not joyful, but hey, joy is one aspect of life. And there's this wonderful doctor, Dr. Naomi Rachel Raymond. She's written several books, and she points out, that in the medical profession, there's always that concern about burnout, quote unquote. And, people feel that once people burn out, they don't care. And she goes, no, that's not it. They burn out because they refuse to take time to grieve. And when you give yourself permission to grieve, you allow that wonderful presence of sorrow, to be able to get that pain out of your heart and all. But what happens is if you turn off your emotional response to death or sorrow, you turn off your emotional response to other things too. So there's that, and when I had that knowing, when Carla had read this to me from Dr. Raymond's book, it's like, yeah, of course, growing up in a blue-collar family in Chicago, I was stoic. And, what a bunch of, you're really screwing yourself up, if you're not willing to express the wide range of emotions that we have. Now, one of the unique things about the Christian tradition is that ours is perhaps the only spiritual belief system that talks about joy. You look at the other spiritual beliefs that all life is suffering, and it's like, yeah, but, occasionally I'd like to be happy. And so when you look at the four Gospels that, are these four different versions of the life of Jesus Christ, you hear him talking about joy. And when you consider the times, those were not easy times, about 2,000 years ago. The Israelites were under the occupation of the world's superpower, the Roman Empire. And they were oppressively taxed, to the point where you spent basically your whole day earning enough money so you could just survive because you were giving, it was a 65% flat tax rate, you had to give to the Romans. And often we read, about the tax collectors coming around. And I think back, though, of during the Great Depression. You see these movies that were made during the Great Depression, and all of them were trying to evoke joy, and get people thinking in another way than depression. We're in the money, all of those things. It was Hollywood saw that sense of you need to give people hope, faith, peace, love, and joy. So when Jesus started coming around and talking about joy as being a possibility, that was one of the things that got people following him. They wanted to hear the good news, the Gospels that that Jesus was teaching. So he shared techniques, strategies, methods to experience the joy of simply being alive. It didn't relate to whether you were being oppressed by someone. It was just a matter of wow, look at the amazing thing that we're all experiencing together, life. Now, last week I took a deep dive into the story that's commonly known as the prodigal son. And it's in the Gospel of Luke in the 15th chapter, starting with the 11th verse. And if you weren't here last week, the basic story is Jesus is telling the parable about these two, this father who has two sons, and the two sons, the younger one actually comes to his dad and says, I'd like you to give me my share of the inheritance so that I can go somewhere else, So the father gives him his money, and he goes off to a far country where things don't go very well for him. And then he comes back thinking, that he's not going to be received very kindly, but his father receives him well. But I was thinking about that sense that a lot of people have experienced, that sense of things are not going well for me here, so I'm just going to move. The geographic cure, I'll just do this, I'll just do that. And I'm reminded of the story of the wise old man who was sitting outside of an ancient city, and this man comes walking up and says, what are the people like in this town up ahead? And he says, well, what were they like back where you came from? And the man starts listing all these awful things. And the wise man looks to him and goes, well, the people in this town will be the same. Because it's all about your perception and how you treat other people, how much respect you give to other people. So, the geographic cure, of course, the other saying that a lot of people know is the grass is always greener on the other side. But is it really? A lot of times we can find joy in our own backyard if we're willing to know how and where to look for it. So I'm going to share 4 points, and I know you've got the handout there in your bulletin, about experiencing the joy of being alive. First is look at your rules. I hear a lot of people joke about how, where's the rule book of life? I'd like to see the rule book of life. Well, there isn't one really, but what happens is we make one up as we go along. We come up with the rules of how we're going to live our life. And that is affected by both pleasant and unpleasant experiences. So you have this accumulation of your life experiences, you know what needs to happen, and yet some of those rules can get in the way of joy. There's this misperception of more being better. You know, if you take a homeless person, you give them shelter, you give them food, you give them clothing, you have added something to their life, and they're feeling much better. And as children, we kind of notice that sense of that adding of something to our life seems to make it better, but what we discover is that's only to a certain point. When you get to the point where you have your basic needs met, you're fine. But a lot of us get caught up in continuing to add things to our life. You know, that whole sense of materialism. If I just do this, if I just do that, then I'll be happy. You know, there's like one man who said, you know, he thought that being happy was having a $2,000 suit, always having at least $500 in his wallet, owning an expensive home, driving an expensive car, but you know, you get to the point of like, is this all there is? More material often causes more complication in our lives. There was a woman whose the only way she'd experience joy was when all of her work was done. The problem was, she never had all of her work done. And I can kind of relate to that. I know as a minister, and I know, you know, I've shared before, that every week I can come up with 80 things that I should do that week. I've learned to celebrate if I can make it to 20 of those. You know, you know, as I've shared with the board, it's like, okay, there are these things that are important and there are these things that are urgent. You know, yeah, some things can be important, but do they really need to be done today? So, and that's where following that guidance, you know, that intuition really comes in, which I'll touch on here in a moment. One man said knew he could be joyful when he was tired. I remember this wonderful couple that lived across the street from me when I was a kid, the Myers. And I grew up in Chicago, and you know, on our street, my dad was a firefighter, and we had two other police officers who lived on this one block stretch, you know, in Chicago. And the man across the street, his father had been a cop, and his son became a cop, you know. And so his big thing was when he gets to that point of retirement and the full pension level, he'll be happy. So he retires. 6 months later, he's dead. You know, so it's kind of like, if you, in your mind, have set up a rule that you'll just be happy when this happens, what's wrong with that picture? And are you really going to allow this to happen? I know I'm a recovering perfectionist, as I said, and so sometimes, you know, I can be pretty hard on myself when I don't get the things done that I thought I should get done. And I've gotten a lot better in recent years when I've taken some time off, you know, a vacation week or two, and, you know, I'll come up with my list of things that I could do that week. Back just before he retired, Tom Brokaw took off one summer as the NBC News anchorman. And in his first day back, he described about how he came up with this list of things he was going to do, kind of like a sabbatical. He said, I looked at the list every day, and then I'd take my grandson fishing. And he says, and after 3 months, I found I didn't get anything done on that list. But what I did do was I had a chance to recharge the batteries. So some people can find joy in the ordinary, even the mundane. There's one very common thread that I see of people that are just joyous, and that is when I see someone holding their first grandchild. You know, and these days with Facebook, it's very easy to see that on a regular basis. So, will you experience joy today? If not, why? What's holding you back? So, as I said, look at your rules. Are they too complex, too difficult, too complicated, or too unreasonable? Now, that leads me to the second guideline, and that is look at your relationships. Now, don't get me wrong, it's important that if we have an unhealthy or toxic relationship that we extract ourselves from it. But there's something about being a spiritual being having a human experience. We need other people. You know, and I think we're all put here together because we have this wonderful gift of being able to see the best in another person and bring out the best in another person. So it's important for us to develop, you know, supportive, positive relationships. Psychologists tell us there are 3 ways we respond to perceived danger: fight, flight, or freeze. And for people who have not experienced joy for a while, they will withdraw from other people. You know, they'll cocoon. They're too tired to fight, so they choose flight. Now, flight can be like our prodigal son going off to a different country, but sometimes it can be just escaping into that cocoon of, of not going out ever. So, if an individual has, a poor self-image, that can also be one of those blockages to experiencing joy. Of course, remember Jesus when he was asked what's the greatest of the 10 Commandments by these scribes who were trying to trick him, and he says, let me give you what I feel my two most important commandments are. One is that you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, and the second one is like it, that is you will love your neighbor as yourself. And the one thing that struck me one time in looking at that verse is, love thy neighbor as thyself. Well, what if I loathe myself? Am I going to loathe my neighbors? A lot of times we take out our inner struggle on other people. And of course, another way of having flight is to dive into substance abuse. Alcoholism, drugs, whatever. Sometimes overeating can be that thing too, that sense of like, okay, I need to just kill out all of the emotional pain that I need to address. Well, until you actually face that emotional pain and are willing, like I said before, feel some sorrow, and to forgive ourselves, it can be a challenge to experience joy. And as I mentioned, I found a wonderful counselor who did a great job and just helped me walk through those old rules and the relationships that I had and the relationships that I had at that point, and how to proceed. Now, the third guideline is be intentional about your growth. In ministerial school and seminary, Carl, our class, we had 29 people, and we had this saying. We'd say, so how's it going today? And I'd say AFGO. And AFGO was an acronym for another growth experience, or another growth opportunity was what it was. And so, sometimes the willingness to step up to the challenge that we have in our life, to change our way of thinking, change our way of operating. Difference between a rut and a grave is 6 feet. Are we willing to change? And of course, sometimes our most astounding growth can come out of making our mistakes, which really aren't mistakes. They're an opportunity for us to understand who we are and who we are not. And when we experience those times when this is not who I am, it establishes me much more clearly who I really want to be and who I truly am. So, there are times when natural transition brings change, going off to college, getting married, getting a new job, having a loved one pass away. These are all changes that come and shake up our rules, shake up our relationships. Perhaps you can make a radical change right where we are. In your mind, is it possible? Is it possible that you can be healed of sickness or disease? Is it possible for you to have healthy relationships right now? Is it possible for your significant other to change for the better? Is it possible for that boss from hell to change? Or perhaps the boss from hell will leave? Is it possible for you to prosper right now where you are under your certain circumstances? That's what our prosperity principles are all about. So it is possible to change simply by changing our perception, changing our assumption, changing our rules, changing our attitude. And number 4 is pray for God to guide you. Look at God, ask for wisdom, and affirm divine order. Affirm that divine order is now established in our minds, bodies, and affairs. And of course, as I often talk about the divine idea concept, our minds are always connected to the divine mind, but sometimes we fall asleep to it. So if we open up our mind to the divine mind, these divine ideas come. And they come with everything they need for us to let a divine idea unfold here in the physical world. The 2 things we always need to do, though, is 1, believe that divine ideas exist, and then be willing to express the ones that we know in our intuition are right for us to express. So, sometimes, though, these divine ideas will scare the hell out of us. But you know, that's a pretty good thing to have the hell scared out of us. Let's get it out of us. Let's get hell out of us. Let's get sin out of us. And that's basically any time we try to negate a divine idea. And one of those times when we try to negate the divine idea is that we can't experience joy today. So here are this week's takeaways. Number 1, look at your rules. Number 2, look at your relationships. Number 3, look at your growth. And number 4, look to God. Now, earlier I gave you the footprints in the sand of the guy having the dream. This new one that I enjoyed by the prolific author Anonymous that landed in my email box was, I was having a dream and I was walking with God. And all of these scenes were flashing over the life, the chapters of my life. And then we turned and we looked back, and I saw that for a while we were walking together, but then I saw one set of footprints, but then I realized, no, actually there's a smaller set of footprints inside the bigger set of footprints. And I realized, oh, that's when I was doing my best to be a spiritual being having a human experience, to walk in the footsteps of God. He says, and my footsteps started growing and growing and growing to the point where it was all one footstep again. And then all of a sudden there were 2 footsteps, but the footprints were all over the place. And I said to God, I kind of get where I was growing spiritually, but what's all of this thing here? And God turned to me and said, that's when you were dancing. The closing Bible verse from the Gospel of John, 16th chapter, 23rd verse. If you ask anything of the Father, he will give it to you in my name. Before now you have asked nothing in my name. Ask and you shall receive, that your joy may be full. And may you always be open to God's guidance and grace. Let's prepare for meditation.